Hey everyone, it's JC. Welcome back to my channel. This card features the Build a Flower Fuchsia stamp and die set, and what I wanted to do with this bundle is watercolor these lovely images, but also showcase a watercolor technique with Altenew watercolor brush markers. Negative space painting creates emphasis on the focal images of your composition. Shadow cannot exist without light, and therefore painting the shapes around your object are just as important as your main subject. So I use negative space painting to add depth on this card and highlight the fuchsia flowers, giving the illusion that some flowers are in front of others without adding height to the card with foam squares or die cuts. I left the arrangement monochromatic to showcase the Winter Wonderland watercolor brush markers from Altenew. Before I go into detail about watercoloring this card, I'll plug the Altenew Build-A-Flower subscription if you're new to stamping. Altenew Build-A-Flower subscription service will give you a specially discounted rate on next month's Build-A-Flower set. This includes the stamp and die you're about to see. If you wait to purchase this set without the subscription, you run the risk of losing item stock or paying full retail price for the stamp and die combo. I have more information on this linked in the description box. So here is the Build-A-Flower Fuchsia stamp and die set. This stamp set contains 3 layerable fuchsias, 2 layerable leaves, and branches and 4 sentiment stamps. Personally, I prefer outline stamp sets because I love using my own coloring mediums besides inks. As I mentioned earlier, I will use the Winter Wonderland watercolor brush markers. I purchased these as part of a bundle that included Altenew's permanent black ink pad. If you haven't used these watercolor brush markers before, getting started is super easy. Simply unscrew the brush end of the watercolor barrel and keep the brush upright. Remove and discard the yellow plastic ring and reassemble the brush end to the barrel until tight. Lastly, press on the push embossed segment of the barrel end of the brush marker until you see color travel to the tip of the brush. This may take 5 to 7 squeezes. As with any coloring medium, I highly suggest swatching on your most used canvas. In this case, I use Arch's cold press 140-pound watercolor paper the most, so I've got a scrap piece here already labeled for swatching. This piece is small enough to fit back into the watercolor brush packaging so I can easily reference it. Okay, now let's get on with the painting part of this video. Off camera, I went ahead and stamped all the outline images several times on some sticky notes to act as masking paper. In my mini MISTI, I'll put a larger piece of watercolor paper to accommodate from the shrinking and warping from drying. All I'll do is arrange the stamps and masks, and I'm referencing a fuchsia arrangement online just to get some help with how the clusters look realistically. The pistils and stamens are not going to overlap in the final arrangement, so I neglected including them in the sticky note masks just to save a lot of effort. I'm stamping the images in Distress Ink Antique Linen because of the water reactivity for no outline coloring. Basically, in the final result, you won't see the yellowish outline when the arrangement is colored. So I fast forward to the final fuchsia branch. I don't mind that the leaves overlapped either. I'll be coloring in some of these leaves, so in the end you won't see that they weren't masked. I'm not shooting for perfection, that's the beauty of a handmade card. Before I begin painting, I'll put down the Altenew stamping silicone map over top my glass work surface because of the grip I'll have on this paper. Using the swatch chart I made earlier, I'll work with the 3 green, blue-greens in the Winter Wonderland bundle from Altenew. So I'll mix Mountain Mist, Emerald, and Lagoon in this project. Off camera to my right, I have a glass of clean water. I'm also using a round watercolor brush to help diffuse the watercolor brush marker pigment. So what I'm doing is coloring around the outside of my stamped images, going right up against the outline and diffusing the pigment with clean water. The fine point of the watercolor brush markers makes it really easy to trace the images. I'm working in sections from the lightest of the 3 greens. I find it easier to work in segments so that I can easily blend and diffuse the color into the watercolor paper. I am also working from lightest to darkest marker because it is much easier to add shade to your project than take it away. And I'm constantly assessing the scene as a whole. Questions I'm asking myself are, does this flower appear more forward than the one behind it? Does the scene optically make sense as a whole? And do I need more contrast between light and dark? This card isn't meant to be perfect. This is just a fun coloring project playing with lights and darks to get a scene that pops out of the card. Sometimes observing a scene between the flowers and leaves is much easier to interpret and outline than the flower petals, leaf veining, plant stems, and I'll keep working to add depth to the outside of the leaves and flowers. Once I'm happy with the way the shadows and outlines look as a complete scene, then I'll begin pulling elements forward and pushing them back by adding darker shadows around elements. I want more on the foreground and diffusing the color on top of leaves and flowers. So here you'll see that I'm squeezing the liquid from the brush onto the silicone mat and using the watercolor brush to paint on the positive part of the scene. I wanted to diffuse and lighten the color from the brush immediately. And you'll see that I'm literally doing the same thing as before, but this time I'm pulling images forward by leaving them wider and pushing images backward by adding color. The internet is a great resource to help with where shadows go on the flowers and leaves. Another great option is the trifold included in all Altenew stamp sets. This way you can see the layering images and where the depth goes in the illustration, and simply mimic the image with your painting. Work in layers and slowly add color because, like I said earlier, it is much easier to add depth than it is to undo the mistake of adding too much color. This entire painting process took me about 2.5 hours, but honestly I had a drink and no other responsibilities for the day, so I was able to focus on color away. I refined certain outlines with a colored pencil that was close to the darkest shade of watercolor brush marker. This helped bring back some definition into the stamens and pistils, petals, leaves, and the stem of the arrangement. Before I finished this card, I couldn't help myself and I had to add splatters to this arrangement. I didn't want to cover up the image that I worked so hard to color, so I took a scrap piece of paper and covered the arrangement so the splatters only dropped on the outside of the painting. I'm using the liquid from the watercolor brush by simply squeezing out the pigment so that it coordinates nicely. And after that, I trimmed down the panel to 4¼ by 5½ and added the sentiment using Obsidian pigment ink from Altenew. Using a pigment ink allowed for an ultra black impression, but also pigment ink helps give a great image for textured surfaces. Just make sure to wait until it is dry before taking your watercolor paper to your card base. Miss Laura Jane, one of my favorite crafters and Altenew Educator Certification Program participants, recommended to me to spray the back of the watercolor piece with clean water and press the panel beneath heavy books to help combat warping. So that's exactly what I did to help keep the piece flat before adhering it to my card base. And that finishes this negative space watercolor card. I hope you take this concept and apply it to your future watercolor projects. Trust me, you'll see a very dramatic difference in the end result of your paintings. All the Altenew materials I used are linked below in the description box. Thank you so much for supporting my channel, and thanks to Team Altenew for sending this wonderful Build-A-Flower Fuchsia stamp set my way so I can create something with you all. I'll talk to you all very soon, and have the best day.